Ooze is one of Magic's many creature types. They tend to be sentient blobs of slime or other substances that consume everything in their path. Ooze is one of Magic's oldest creature types, originally appearing in 1994's Legends, and since then they've been printed with regularity. In fact, there are 2 of them in Magic's most recent set, Modern Horizons 3. In all, there are 62 Oozes in Magic the Gathering, and in this video we'll take a look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Because this is actually the second time I've looked at Oozes, I did them the first time in November of 2020, we're going to start with a quick look at the 4 that were on the list 4 years ago, but aren't on it this time, starting with Mitotic Slime, which was at number 9 last time. For 4 generic and a green, it's a 4/4, and when it dies you create 2 2/2 tokens, and they have, when this dies, create 2 1/1 green Ooze tokens. Many Oozes either do something with creature tokens or +1/+1 counters. The tokens often represent the ability of Oozes to split into smaller Oozes, and the counters represent their ability to absorb stuff. In this case, we've got an Ooze that does a great job of representing the latter. The flavor here is pretty cool, as the idea is that try as you might to kill this thing, it's going to keep splitting into smaller slimes that you also have to kill. This token generation makes Mitotic Slime give you a ton of value for 5 mana. Its 1 point came in a standard Birthing Pod deck back in 2011. It goes great with the pod because you can sacrifice it to tutor up a 6-drop, but you don't really give up any board presence to do it, and that feels pretty good. Next there's Umori the Collector, who was at number 8 last time. For 2 generic and 2 black-green hybrid mana, it's a 4/5, and when it enters the battlefield you choose a card type, and spells with that type cost 1 generic less to cast. It also has Companion, which means you can have access to the card if it's in your sideboard as long as you meet the requirement. Which in this case is that every non-land card in your deck has the same type. If your deck can do that, you can pay 3 generic to put Umori from your sideboard into your hand, and obviously if you do meet the requirement, Umori will be decreasing the cost of every spell in your deck. Umori was briefly a very heavily played card in Standard, showing up as the companion in many aggro decks, but this was all before the companion rule got nerfed, and the rule got nerfed quickly enough that Umori never really had an opportunity at a major event. Originally, companions could just be cast from your sideboard, which is significantly stronger. It basically meant you could start the game with an 8-card hand. Since the rule change in June 2020, Umori has still seen some intermittent play, usually in decks that meet the deck building requirement without even trying, like Winota decks in Standard, which look to run as many creatures to trigger her as possible. Umori hasn't gained any points since 2021 though. At number 7, I've got Handwire Garrison and Handwire Battlements. That's because these 2 cards together make an Ooze. If that sounds confusing, let me explain. Handwire Battlements is a land that can tap for colorless, or you can pay a red and tap it to give something haste. Handwire Garrison is a 2/3 that costs 2 generic and a red, and when it attacks, you make 2 1/1 red human creature tokens. These 2 cards are pretty nice on their own, but should you ever have both in play, you can activate the Battlement's ability for 3 generic and 2 red, and you get to meld these 2 cards together. This means you flip them both over and then combine them into Handwire the Writhing Township, a 7/4 legendary Eldrazi Ooze with Trample and Haste that spits out 2 3/2 Eldrazi Horror tokens when it attacks. Because this is a meld card, I only rewarded points for this list for decks that actually ran both of these, as each of these cards individually have actually seen play here and there, but if you're only running one, you don't actually have access to the Ooze. They were played together a little bit in red aggro decks and Standard, where each side individually was pretty useful, and having access to the absurd Eldrazi side was pretty sweet. It hasn't top-8'd anything since 2017 though. And the last card to make the 2020 list that didn't make it this time is Predator Ooze, which was at number 6. For 3 generic mana, it's an indestructible 1/1, and you put a +1/+1 counter on it when it attacks. Furthermore, if a creature dealt damage by the Ooze dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on it, so it's hard to kill and constantly growing. It was played in green aggro decks when it was in Standard. There it was often played alongside Ulvenwald Tracker. The Ooze was great for fighting with, because it could always survive, and it could get a counter if it killed something. The Ooze hasn't gained any points since 2013 though. Alright, now that we've covered the 4 cards who lost their spot on the list, let's move to the list proper, starting with Ochre Jelly, which didn't even exist back in 2020 because it was printed in 2021's Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. For X and a green, it's a 0/0 with Trample that enters with X +1/+1 counters on it, and when it dies, if it had 2 or more +1/+1 counters on it, you create a token that's a copy of it at the beginning of the next end step, and that token enters the battlefield with half that many +1/+1 counters on it rounded down. So this ooze does stuff with counters and tokens, and it's meant to represent a jelly from Dungeons & Dragons, which had oozes before Magic ever did. It gained all of its points in Standard between 2021 and 2022, where it was primarily played in Gruul aggro decks. These decks could generate some extra value out of counters, with cards like Thundering Raiju, who can put counters places and deal more damage the more modified creatures you have. However, the jelly has been active since 2022, and if I revisit this list again in 4 years, it probably won't be here. At number 9, it's Necrotic Ooze, which is at number 5 last time. For 2 generic and 2 black, it's a 4/3, and it has the activated abilities of all creatures in all graveyards. While most oozes represent their ability to absorb stuff with +1/+1 counters, Necrotic Ooze does it in a more unique way by gaining access to activated abilities of the things it's absorbed. Obviously enough, you need to load your graveyard up for this to be worthwhile, but that was pretty easy in Legacy, where Necrotic Ooze gained all of its points. The Ooze was played back in 2010 in Ooze Survival, a deck that utilized Survival of the Fittest to both tutor up and load the graveyard for the Ooze. The deck could win with regular graveyard and toolbox shenanigans, but it could also put Triskelion and Phyrexian Devourer into your graveyard, at which point the Ooze would gain both of their activated abilities and be able to immediately kill the opponent. You would just exile cards from your library to get counters, and then remove them all using Triskelion's ability to do damage to your opponent. Later in 2010, Survival of the Fittest got banned in Legacy, and Necrotic Ooze hasn't found another home since then. At number 8, it's Oran Reef Ooze, a newcomer to the list. While it existed when I made the 2020 list, it had only been around a month and a half, and it hadn't managed the top 8 yet. For 2 generic and a green, it's a 2/2 that puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control when it enters, and when it attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature with a +1/+1 counter on it. Both of those abilities count itself, so you can put the counter on it, and if it has counters, it will grow itself. It was played alongside Ochre Jelly in Standard and Gruul aggro decks with a +1/+1 counter theme, and it was also played in Mono Green aggro, but it hasn't top 8'd anything since 2022. At number 7, it's Biogenic Ooze, which is at number 4 last time. For 3 generic and 2 green, it's a 2/2 that makes a 2/2 ooze when it enters, and at the beginning of your end step, it puts a +1/+1 counter on each of your oozes, and you can pay 1 generic and 3 green to make a 2/2 ooze. So the baseline here is usually 5 mana for 2 3/3s, since they both grow at the end of your turn, and they're going to keep growing too, and it can spit out even more oozes if you wanted to. Biogenic Ooze gained all of its points in Standard and Wilderness Reclamation decks. These decks tend to have a ton of mana lying around, and you usually need instant speed stuff to take advantage of the Reclamation's ability to double your mana, and Biogenic Ooze is a great mana sink to have when your lands are constantly untapping. Wilderness Reclamation was eventually banned, and Biogenic Ooze has now rotated out of Standard, so it hasn't gained any points in about 4 years. At number 6, it's Necroplasm, which was at number 10 last time. It's the only ooze from the 2020 list that actually moved up. For 1 generic and 2 black, it's a 1/1, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. At the end of your turn, you destroy each creature with the mana value equal to the number of +1/+1 counters on Necroplasm. It also has Dredge 2, which means that if you would draw a card and it's in your graveyard, you can mill 2 cards and return it to your hand instead. So this ooze not only grows like many of them do, it also constantly destroys creatures. Obviously, once you get to 3 counters, the plasm will destroy itself, but Dredge means you can get it right back and start all over if you want to. It's gained all of its points in Modern, largely in toolbox decks. These are decks that use Court of Calling or Eldritch Evolution to search up singleton creatures in the deck, and when you get hate cards at the right time, they tend to be super powerful. The plasm is particularly strong against decks like Hardened Scales and Crashing Footfalls. Against those decks, even just having 0 counters on the Plasm can have a huge impact on the board. Hardened Scales decks are reliant on lots of 0 mana value creatures, like Walking Ballista, and Footfalls decks are all about making Rhino tokens that the Plasm can destroy. Then, if it's allowed to stick around, it can usually destroy some 1 mana stuff against those decks too. Necroplasm is a great card for modern toolboxes right now, so it's got a great shot at continuing to move up the list. At number 5, it's Experiment 1, which has dropped 2 slots since 2020. For 1 green mana, this Ooze is a 1/1 with Evolve, which means that anytime a creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it has greater power or toughness in the experiment, you put a +1/+1 counter on the experiment. It can also remove 2 +1/+1 counters to regenerate. This makes Experiment 1 a fairly potent 1-drop, as if you continue to curve out, you end up with way more than 1 mana worth of creature, and its ability to regenerate can even make it a pain to deal with. The experiment has seen play in 5 formats, but has never really been heavily played in any of them. It's generally been played in various aggro decks like Zoo, Mono Green, and Humans. It's likely to keep gaining points, but the cards in front of it either have a huge lead or are seeing more play, so number 5 might be the best the experiment can do, at least for a while. At number 4, it's Ave, Progenitor Ooze, a newcomer to the list. It was printed in 2021's Modern Horizons 2, which means it didn't exist back in 2020, and it means the only 60-card paper formats it's ever been legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. For 2 generic and 3 green, it's a legendary Ooze with Storm, and that means when you cast it, you copy it for each spell cast before it this turn, and those copies become tokens. Eve tokens aren't legendary, and it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each other Ooze you control. So yeah, this can spit out multiple bodies and then come down as a massive Ooze if your Storm count was high enough. It's gained points in both Modern and Legacy Storm decks, usually in the sideboard. In Modern, Storm decks play Wish, which can grab Eve out of the sideboard once the Storm count is high enough. In Legacy, decks try to win with Tendrils of Agony most of the time, but can't do that if the opponent has given themselves hexproof, so Eve is something you can bring in against opponents you know who are going to side in that type of hate. Eve is going to continue to gain points in both Modern and Legacy, and it's got a good chance at moving up the list. At number 3, it's Slogurk the Overslime, a newcomer to the list that was printed in 2021. For 1 generic, a green and a blue, it's a 3/3 with Trample, and whenever a land is put into your graveyard from anywhere, you put a +1/+1 counter on Slogurk. You can also remove 3 counters to return it to your hand, and when it leaves the battlefield, you return up to 3 lands from your graveyard to your hand. So, yeah, Slogurk really likes lands in the graveyard. He's particularly powerful alongside the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty Channel lands, which he's played with in Standard, Modern, and Legacy. These lands give you spell-like effects and go directly to the graveyard, which grows Slogurk, and you can always get them back by returning Slogurk to your hand. That's a pretty insane value engine, and that's what has allowed Slogurk to make an impact on 3 different formats. He's likely to keep gaining points in the future. At number 2, it's Acidic Slime, which was also at number 2 last time. For 3 generic and 2 green, it's a 2/2 with Death Touch that destroys an artifact, enchantment, or land when it enters the battlefield. Thanks to that ability plus Death Touch, most of the time it represents a 2-for-1. Acidic Slime gained most of its points in Standard, a format it has had some extra time in thanks to 4 separate core set reprints. It's mostly been a sideboard card, one that could deal with dominant cards like Valakut Molten Pinnacle and Birthing Pod, and the various equipment played in Cobblade decks. It was also briefly played in Modern Birthing Pod decks since it was a good thing to tutor up with the pod when it had a good target, like an opposing Birthing Pod. If Acidic Slime were reprinted, it might be played in Standard again, but unless that happens, I don't think it will gain any more points, although 51 seems to be a lot for Oozes, so he might still be number 2 for a pretty long time. And at number 1, probably not surprising anyone, it's Scavenging Ooze, which is at number 1 last time too, and it's only extended its lead over the last 4 years. For 1 generic and a green, you get a 2/2, and it has an ability that lets you pay 1 green and exile a card from a graveyard. If that card was a creature, the Ooze gets a +1/+1 counter and you gain 1 life. The Ooze is great, because it lets you hate on the graveyard while also getting some additional value out of the ability, including some really nice incidental life gain. While it saw some play in Standard, Modern is really where it's made a name for itself over the years. It's basically a staple in green decks in the format, with Jund, Abzan, and Collected Company decks common homes for it. It's also seen some play in Legacy Elf and 4-color control decks, and it's also legal in Pioneer, where it's played in Devotion to Green and various green aggro decks. It's hard to imagine any Ooze ever displacing Scavenging Ooze from its number 1 spot on the list. So those are the best Oozes in Magic the Gathering. If you want to own any of them, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past MTG top 10s, including about 100 that look at creature types, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.